I'm the CEO of Open UK, and I think Dan mentioned us a couple of presentations ago. Okay, let me see what we can do. It's kind of good to have them, but it's not the end of the world if I don't. So Dan mentioned Open UK a couple of presentations ago, and he was talking about sort of legal and governance and falling foul of legal. So I should probably start by confessing. We're going to make that work. So I should start by confessing that I used to be a lawyer, if there's such a thing as used to be a lawyer. And I started my career in open source 15 years ago. I joined a company called Canonical, which most of you will know. It's probably less fashionable now than it was then, but we were the hip kids on the block in 2008. And we were known as the commercial sponsor of Ubuntu. In the 5 years that I was there, I set up and ran the legal team, and I guess we went from 0 to over 70% of the Cloud OS market overnight. That was actually quite a painful thing to happen because it was right at the start of cloud and we hadn't worked out business models in that space. So I normally talk about that kind of business model stuff. I talk about strategy, about policy. For the last couple of years, I've been talking about Brexit, about geopolitical shift, how the world's changing. And I've never talked to anybody else about what I'm talking to you about today. But I am writing a report for O'Reilly on it, so I thought I would try you out. So I am looking for feedback. I was told once feedback's a blessing. If it's not good, be gentle with me. And I want to talk to you a bit about how I got into open source and why it matters to me and what Open UK is as I get to that story about open source and whether it's going to fail or not. So when I left Canonical, I realized that what I wanted to do with my life was still work in open source, and there were no jobs for lawyers in Europe, and I didn't want to work in the US, I didn't want to move to the Bay Area. So I joined a law firm for a couple of years and didn't make very much money. Most of the open source companies around 2012, 13, 14 had no money. It was before open source really got fashionable. So I ended up doing a lot of pro bono work, and I ended up on a lot of advisory boards. And one that sort of shifted my thinking quite a lot was being on this UN advisory board, which I chaired. Last year, I got a government appointment onto the Open Standards Board. I joined that. I don't think I'm a standards expert, but open source is a very tiny subcategory at the end of the Open Standards Board's remit. And this year, I stood for election for the OSI. You'll see as we go through this talk that for me, the OSI is really important to the future of open source. I spend a lot of my time talking. A lot of the videos about the stuff that I have mentioned to you already is aggregated in this website. And I spent a lot of the last 5 years working on this book. It is a book that has been strangely popular since it came out 2 weeks ago. And I say strangely because to me it's a legal textbook. It's 640 pages long, and I've had to read it about 5 times. And when I say read it, I didn't write it. So I've written one chapter, and there are 26 authors who've written the other chapters. If you want it, it is open access, and you'll find that hidden away on the OUP website. But if you go back to my website, it's very, very clear where the open access is, and it's open access non-commercial. There's also a flyer with a 30% discount if you feel the need to own a physical copy of it. And it's been strangely popular. So I put this on Twitter, and I just put it on Twitter like one evening at home. The final paper copies had arrived. It was 5 years of work, so I said that. And it's got 250,000 impressions on Twitter. And that to me is really weird, right? Why would people like a law book? And I guess that will come out as I talk to you a bit more. It also, when we did this launch and rally at All Things Open 2-3 weeks ago, with this great panel of 5 of the female authors and myself, it went viral on the Chinese internet. So it is now being translated into Mandarin by a Chinese publisher, which is all completely beyond me, but people seem to want to know more about this space, the space that Dan was talking about and not falling foul of legal. But it also covers a lot of stuff that you might find useful, like building an OSPO, how to build communities. There's stuff around export control, there's stuff around economics of open source, commercialization, business models, the kind of things that you need if you want to run a business in open source. So about 3 years ago, I got involved with Open UK, almost exactly 3 years ago. And when I was first approached to do it, I said no, because I thought it was a really xenophobic idea to have a geographic organisation. Didn't appeal to me at all. I'd worked internationally since 2000. I think in the 5 years at Canonical, I did 2 transactions, 2 deals with companies that were in Europe and Asia. The rest was in the US, so I was used to not being here. But actually, I realised that what's happened is that 10, 12 years ago, the UK was in a world-leading position, and we were the first country in the world to have an open source first public policy. Most of you probably don't know that. And that policy has been adapted and replayed across the globe, but we haven't made a big song and dance about what we've done. So I realised that what was happening with Brexit was the Europeans were picking up on all the work we'd done 10 years ago, and we were going to fall behind. So I went off and I found this motley crew. Most of them are still on board. A couple of them are in the room today. And they were people that I knew. Now, they weren't my mates. There's often a perception that I've brought together people who are my mates. Most of the people involved are people that I'd met once or twice. 1 or 2 of them I was a bit intimidated by. And then there are people who've joined the leadership team, which is all pro bono. There's 2 of us paid now. And the ambassadors, and again, you'll recognise many of these faces, who, again, I don't know. And it's about recognising the talent that we've got in the UK. We've got about 50 ambassadors. There's always room for more. We're about to launch international ambassadors and something called apprentice ambassadors. And the idea is that we'll have the ambassadors mentor the apprentices and help develop their careers and hopefully bring some of them through to be the board of the future. And we've tried to build an organisation that's diverse. So it wasn't from day one set out that we needed a diverse organisation. I think with a female-led organisation, you attract more women, more ethnic minorities. But we're really now focusing on that because we do have one of the most diverse organisations in UK tech. And we want to make sure that we keep it that way. But that doesn't mean that there's not room for you, right? Because we're all diverse in our own ways. And that's why we've gone with belonging rather than DEI for what we're doing. We work on 3 pillars: community, legal and policy, and learning. So the community side is about bringing all of you together, all of the leaders across open source. And that's why we do things like the Ambassador Programme. Next week, we've got our awards ceremony at the House of Lords. Last year, we had it at COP26, sponsored by different open source companies. It's not a money-making exercise. It's one of the downsides of my job that I end up on shortlists for awards that I never win. But always the bridesmaid, right? So, but then they ask us for money. So there was one we didn't go to last night where I was shortlisted for Women of the Year, yay! And it was 500 quid a ticket, which is why we didn't go to it. Occasionally we'll get a sponsor to pay for tables. Our awards aren't like that, and they're the only ones I trust. And I trust them because I have nothing to do with them. We nominate people, we bring in judges. Jonathan Riddle from KDE up in Edinburgh manages the judges. I don't know who's won until he tells us, and then we don't charge people to be part of it. So they are real awards that recognise talent. And we try to do a lot of stuff that recognises talent. We've done honours lists twice. We've done one of influencers. We've done one of what we call Gen Next. Put them out at midnight on Hogmanay, and we had great responses to that. This year we'll have another 100 people being recognised. And the UK's got hundreds and hundreds of people, not just everybody in the room today. I know there's a lot of people online too, but there are hundreds and hundreds of people that we could be recognising as talented, and we want to bring them together. Because when we do, we create power, and we create this cohesive voice that can have impact and influence. And we're doing that through law and policy. So very quickly, we got recognised as the organisation that the Commission thought they should be dealing with. We don't just do this in the UK. We were part of a class action on Google Oracle in the US with other open source organisations. And we submitted to the Biden Ordinance on open source security, which I'll talk about in a minute. On the policy side, it became really clear, you're all great. The work you do is fantastic. The world doesn't know what you do. The world doesn't know that we are the 5th biggest contributor in the globe to open source. The world doesn't know that we're #1 in Europe in terms of open source developers, in terms of open source contribution. And we have to find ways of sharing that message. So last year we started doing these reports. The first one cuts the existing data. The second one was the result of a survey. And the third one was more about case studies, and we got onto sustainability. Just wondering if anybody knows where I put my drink. If anybody finds it and they could give it to me, that'd be great. This year we've started doing the same thing again, and we have, thank you. I forget my head. We've done one phase of the report, which is really huge. It's about 60 pages, but it's got lots of case studies, and you can use those if you're talking to people. So there's case studies of companies like OVO, like Starling Bank, that are entirely built in open source. Other banks talking about the products they use, people like the BBC talking about how they do things like their transcripts using open source. And we show the journey that we've been on. We show how open source is aligned with sustainability. Last year for COP26, we created this data center blueprint, and it shows you that you can have up to 70% carbon emissions reductions using open technology, using software, hardware, data combined. Done one this year for EV charging. And then our third pillar, so the circle in our logo is supposed to be community that takes you into legal and policy. So you take the community's influence to influence laws and policies, and then you teach the next generation, you teach them the skills. And what we've done so far are kids camps. We're working on a MOOC, a massive open online course on entrepreneurship. Entrepreneurship and open source, right? So how you build product, how you build community, how you hire, how you scale, how you generate revenue when you've given all your assets away. And that will be done with Strathclyde University. We also do sort of random things, like over the summer we knew security was high in the agenda, so we did this summer of open source software security. If I sound a bit flatter than I usually do, I didn't get a lot of sleep last night, and I was speaking to Sam yesterday, and she's made me realise what I've done. And I might have taken on more than I can chew, so I might need some help. On the 7th and 8th of February, I have booked 4 or 5 floors of the Queen Elizabeth Conference Centre for the biggest open source conference that the UK's had. It'll be up to 2,000 people, and we've got the area outside, and I have a planning application in to put teepees on the lawn outside and food trucks, but it's quite a lot, right? And it's only 10 weeks. And Sam started to explain to me yesterday some of the things that she thought I would need to make the conference really good. So every time I see this logo now, I feel a sense of dread and panic. But the URL is there. The site isn't even really finished, but it's live, and there's an Eventbrite as a stopgap. But if you'd have a look at it, and if you want to come, it's 199 quid for the 2 days. I may live to regret that, but it's 199 quid for the 2 days. 7 tracks. And I'll explain to you at the end of this presentation why this is so important. So, the real meat of what I want to talk to you about. When I was at Canonical, it was really hard to sell. It was really hard to make money. It was really hard to build businesses in open source. I know it's not easy today, but it's changed, and there's been this massive, massive shift. And I think this massive shift where you are no longer trying to persuade people to use open source like we were. We were trying to get it through the door. We were stuck, as Dan would tell you, in that legal loop. So we were stuck with risk, we were stuck with procurement, we were stuck with legal, we were stuck with finance, who wouldn't sign contracts for open source, didn't want it in their businesses. It's all over their businesses today, and they have no say in it. And they have no say in it because of digitalization. That has shifted, that has changed everything. Your roles have been elevated. You are now in control because every company either creates, distributes, or has its products consumed using technology. And that digitalization means software defined, which means open source. No escaping it. And that's partly because all of you are in the room now and making the decisions. It's partly because of the repos and the way the public repos have risen in the last decade, making it easier and easier for mainstream organizations to start to use open source. And it's partly because of cloud, as Rory was saying, he was talking about the cloud stats, it's inescapable. So what you've got is a world that is filled with open source, and we've won, right? Time to go home, except now the problems start. So we've won. We've got, depending on whose survey you look at, 48 to 98% of any stack is open source. Over 90% of all software produced is apparently open source. What's open source? So I'm going to ask you all to join me in reciting the open source definition. Can anybody name any of the 10? I was with Bruce Perrins earlier this year, who's not very well in hospital just now, so we send him our best. But I was with Bruce Perrins, and he couldn't, and he wrote it. You know, he was looking at our kids' camp for a crib sheet. This matters, and it matters because if we can't even agree on what it is, how do we know that it's successful or not? And this is something I've been thinking an awful lot about. And for me, one of the key things to understand is that the opposite of open source is not closed source. The opposite of open source is proprietary. So you can open up code and you can make it available and it's still proprietary because it doesn't meet these 10 values. And these 10 values, I can't recite them either. I can't recite anything. But 5 and 6 always stick in my mind, and they're really important. No discrimination amongst people, no discrimination amongst field of endeavor or field of use. Now that's something that's been problematic. And one of the problems that open source has always faced is FUD, fear, uncertainty, and doubt. And we used to blame Microsoft. And I used to know lots and lots of jokes. And all the jokes I knew about open source, the punchline was Microsoft. So I don't know any jokes anymore. Because today, Microsoft is listed, if you look at the stats, as the single biggest contributor to open source. You've got Google in next, then IBM, then Red Hat. And Microsoft will tell you that they've shifted because they've been on a journey caused partly by cloud computing, partly by the fact that all of you and any developers who've learned to code in the last 20 years will only work in an open source way, and partly by the fact their customers today ask for open source. Yet, we've still got this problem. 2020, we see Amazon being accused of doing the wrong thing by using open source the way it wants to, which it can. So long as it complies with the license, it can. Accused of strip mining. And then we see Shay Bannon, the founder of Elastic, writing this blog post saying he's doubling down on open when he's moving to a license that isn't closed source, but isn't open source. A proprietary license that shares code, that shares the source, but doesn't meet the values of open source, the SSPL, and a license that's not approved by the OSI. So to go back to what I was saying, when you think about what is open source, it's definitely about sharing the source, and it's definitely about collaboration, but it also requires an OSI-approved license, and if you don't have that, it's not open source. And that's a brilliant lawyer's definition. This problem's still happening now. Shay Bannon and Elastic weren't the end of it, so there's no doubling down on open going on. We see Lightbound and Akka a couple of months ago now. And it's not just the licensing, it's the standards bodies that are causing us problems now, and the telcos and other sectors that open source is being adopted at scale in. So many of you will not have seen what's going on with standards. There's a FRAND is no friend. So FRAND is free. It's not free, it's fair. FRAND is fair, reasonable, and non-discriminatory patent licensing. And it happens in standards. And what companies do is they go into standards discussions, they become part of the setting of a standard, they bring their patents into it, their patents are adopted, they have a royalty stream from those patents, and everybody pays that royalty on an slip of the tongue, equal basis. So the problem with it is that it doesn't work with GPL, it doesn't work with some of the licensing, but it also sits against our whole ethos. It sits against how open source works if you've suddenly got this royalty blocking how things move around. And what we're seeing is the telcos do not want to lose that royalty. And it's the fundamental problem open source has. Every time we get into a new sector, every time we get adoption at scale, it disrupts. And because it disrupts revenue. And nobody wants their revenue disrupted, right? So they fight back. Microsoft did it, now the telcos are doing it. So we have a real problem going on in this area. And for some of these companies, Ericsson, Nokia, they are companies that don't make the revenue streams they used to. They've had a lot of stuff taken away from them, like roaming. Their handsets may not be fashionable in the way they were. And what they rely on to survive are these revenues. So there's a real battle over billions of dollars of revenue going on that could really impact open source. They're going around rooms like this with other telco people redefining open source. And then we see things like the war in Ukraine. I don't know if anybody else was on this. There was a Twitter call back in March with some of the local guys in Ukraine. It was absolutely heartbreaking. They were talking about how they were sort of putting down their keyboards and taking up arms. There's about 800 people on it. And they were asking that we help them and that we help them by restricting open source going into Russia. And we can't do it. It's just not possible, because when you get into protestware and when you start to restrict who can use, you're making those judgments that stop it being open source. And that's not going to be the only time it happens, right? We're going to see more conflict and more people wanting those kind of things. So we have these problems within our own communities. We have these problems in businesses we're disrupting. We have them on the world stage. But still, open source is doing really well. What's it worth? How do we sell it to people? How do we build enterprises on it? How do we get government to pay attention to it? We've been really terrible at explaining our value. Really, really terrible. One of the things we've tried to do in these reports is show the value. So this stat that you see with the top left corner, the 4.67 billion to 6.65 billion, that's the amount we've worked out with an economist from the National Office of Statistics from our survey results is invested by UK companies in open source each year. That amount is, I think it's 29 times the digital fund in the Levelling Up Fund from the UK government. It's absolutely massive, but nobody understands it. We showed last year 41.5, I'm terrible with numbers and remembering data. I think it's 41.5 billion into the UK GDP, which is 20% of the digital economy. Now that's using really old, to me, out-of-date ways of calculating this stuff. That's looking at total cost of ownership, lines of code, number of developers. We should be looking at value generated at the other end of the sausage machine. We should be looking at what's coming out of the platform economy. And what's coming out of the platform economy, I reckon, is probably 60% of the digital economy. You speak to government and they don't understand what open source is. They understand AI, they understand blockchain, they understand ML, they understand the internet, they understand the cloud. They think that's where all the money is generated. So I've started to explain it like a pizza base. So all of those are the toppings and open source is the base. Everybody's always interested in the toppings. Everybody wants a slice, but take the base away and you've got a sloppy mess. So you need to invest in that base. And they kind of get that explanation. I said 10 years ago we were world leading. We see it in our day-to-day existence through the public sector, through things like the Test and Trace app. Now, I'm not saying ours was the best Test and Trace app or even holding it out as being any good. But what we saw across the Test and Trace apps was that they almost all got open source. Germany did a brilliant job, 2,000 contributions from the community. It's not just the apps, it's not just that interaction as citizens that's now open source, it's also the infrastructure sitting behind it. And therein lies a huge problem. That's been built at pace and often without understanding. And we saw in 2021, the Biden administration put out an ordinance on software security. And if you look at it, it's probably the best thing I've ever seen come out of any government on open source. They have a whole section about supply chain, section on S-bombs. There was a guy who left the White House about 6 weeks ago called Dave Ricordan, who's a long-term open source contributor, and that's, I think, why it was so good. Somebody who actually knew was CTO behind, doing that wording and making it work. So you see that then being lifted and shifted by the European Commission. The new Cyber Act intends to do exactly the same and use exactly the same principles as the US. Currently, the UK does not have a position on supply chain and S-bombs. We're trying to help that change. Last year, of course, that's straight after. You've got Log4j, Shell4j. You see OpenSSF raising hundreds of millions of dollars, and you see the conversation coming out of the US. It's a little bit from our last report from Eric Brewer at Google in the US, who's one of the people who had a lot of influence on what was happening there, and who was one of the 20 companies sitting around the table at the White House discussing security. Atlantic Council, who include me and others across Europe and calls, talking about what's going to happen in this space, how governments are going to manage open source, one of their team wrote this. So we've built a house of cards on open source software, basically, is what they're saying, and they're advising the US government. But what we know is that government is using open source at the same sort of scale as enterprise, and I think many people feel that they're not contributing back. One of the things I've been writing about this year, talking about this year, is the need for a shift to considering open source to be a digital public good. And there's already work going on that, but it's something that I think we all have to get behind. So back to my conference and my sleepless night. So what we're going to do with this conference, if it works, is we're going to have the UN who have committed and international governments on a stage on the morning of the 7th of February in London, bringing the conversation to the UK, making everybody who wants to be there politically welcome from all around the world. And we're aiming to have governments, we're aiming to have public sector, we're aiming to have people who explain how we've got here and what the story is. Because what we know is that they are responsible. The user is responsible for how they use open source. And if they're using it in national critical infrastructure, it's down to them. But what we need is them to understand what they're using. We need them to have good hygiene, good technical hygiene, good governance in how they're doing it. And we need them to work out how they're going to fund that for the future. So the morning of the conference will be all about that for everybody. And it'll be an opportunity for all of you to be in the room and hear the conversation that happens around that table in the White House with 20 companies normally. It will open it up for all of us if we make it work. So please take a look at the URL and help me build this out to be something that actually shifts the conversation, shifts this story, so that when I talk about this in 5 years' time, I'm not saying, how did open source fail? Thank you.